What's going on? In this video, I'm going to give you a rundown of the best photo settings for the Nikon D3100 camera. This would be a great video if you just purchased this camera or if you're interested in purchasing this camera and you just want to get a little bit more information about the best photo settings and how to set this up to take the best pictures possible. So without further ado, let's hop right into the tutorial. Alright, so all the settings that we're going to be talking about are right here inside the shooting menu. And now there isn't a super long list of stuff here, so we're going to be going over each one of these settings and talking about what I would recommend and what I personally use. Now, the shooting menu is all the stuff that's really going to impact the image quality, and these other menus on the side here are more user preference and other settings that don't specifically have to do with image quality. So we're going to stick right to the shooting menu for this video and talking about all these really important settings for taking photos with this camera. Now I will be releasing a more general photography guide with this camera, so stay tuned for that. And that's going to go more over all the other buttons on the outside of the body and actually taking photos with this camera in general. But this video, like I said, is just about the specific photo settings. So if you already know like a general idea of how to take photos and you're just looking for the best settings for photos, that's what this is about. But again, stay tuned for more of a general beginner's guide for taking photos with this camera. But let's get right into the settings. The first thing we're going to be talking about is the picture control. Now what these are basically like presets or filters that go over the photo to change the sharpness and the contrast and the saturation. And so most of these are pretty straightforward. For example, vivid is going to have really vivid colors, so really contrasty, really saturated. Neutral is going to be less saturated, less contrasty. Monochrome, black and white. And you can basically look through these and see which one you like the best. I personally set this at standard because that's a nice normal picture setting. Everything looks really natural and standard, I guess you could say. So I keep mine at standard, but you can mess around with these and see which one looks best for you. Next up, image quality. Now this is a pretty big one. So there's a couple different options here, but there's really only 3 of them that you want to worry about. So if you start down here at JPEG Basic. So a JPEG is a compressed image file, and it's what most things use for images. It's a pretty basic image file. And now there's 3 different settings for JPEG, and you're only going to be worrying about one, which is JPEG Fine. JPEG Normal and Basic are really just not going to cut it. They're going to be a lot lower quality, smaller files that you really don't even want to worry about. So if you want to shoot JPEG, which is a compressed file size, they're pretty small files, shoot JPEG Fine 100% of the time, and don't even worry about JPEG Normal or Basic. One example of why you'd use JPEG Fine is if you want to take photos with this camera and transfer them to your phone or your computer to post on Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn or whatever social media you use, or even email the photos or something like that, you're going to want to use JPEG. And the reason for that is because these are smaller file sizes that'll email easily or they'll post on social media really easily, and you won't need to like edit them or really do any sort of altering with a photo just to send them to somebody. Now on the second hand, if you want to take the highest quality photos you can with this camera that you want to import into something like Adobe Lightroom or some sort of photo editing software and get the most flexibility out of it, if you want to change all the colors and contrast and sharpness and all that sort of stuff, you're going to want to shoot in RAW. And so what RAW is it's an uncompressed photo file, so it uses all the data from the sensor, and it's a very large file size, but it has so much information that you can alter, you can change, and there's so much flexibility to the RAW files that this is what professionals use, and this is what anyone that wants to really alter their photo uses. And so like I said, these are pretty big file sizes, and they're going to fill up your SD card a lot faster than JPEGs, but they're so much more versatile. So I would recommend using RAW files if you want to import your photos into something like Adobe Lightroom or Photoshop or some sort of image editing software and get the most flexibility out of your photos as possible, and you're not worried about small file sizes. And now with RAW photos, what you can do is after you do import them in the editing software and edit them and alter them, do whatever you want to them, you can export them as JPEGs to upload to social media or to share with someone on email or text or something like that. So they're not always going to be RAW files. You can edit them and then transcode them into JPEGs. But again, it's going to take a lot longer. It's going to be a more difficult workflow, and you're not going to be able to just import them right into your computer and post them somewhere. And so then the next setting right in between those is RAW plus JPEG, which is going to basically, every time you take a picture, it's going to save 2 separate files, a RAW file and a JPEG. So if you want the JPEG to just post somewhere real quick, but you want to have the RAW file to edit and alter, after the fact, this is going to be a great setting for you. Now the only issue with this is going to take up even more file size because it's saving 2 files per every photo you take. So I hope that kind of gave you a little bit of a rundown on the image quality and the files. Personally, I shoot in RAW because all the photos I take, I just bring right into Adobe Lightroom and then export them out of there. So you can do whatever works best for you, but personally I shoot in RAW. So the next setting, image size. This will be grayed out if you have your image quality set to RAW. So let me go ahead and switch to JPEG Fine, and there you go, it's not grayed out anymore. So image size is going to be the physical size of your images, basically the dimensions pixel by pixel. And so essentially the larger the dimensions of the photo, the larger the pixels, is going to be higher quality and sharper of an image. Now if you are going to be shooting JPEG, I would always set this to large. It's going to be the best quality, the highest megapixel, the highest resolution, and just overall the sharpest JPEG photos out of this camera. So I would 100% of the time recommend just setting it to large and don't even really worry about the other settings. Now just a quick tip, if you're looking at any of these settings and you have a question about it, you want to learn more about it, there's this question mark right here, and what you do if you go to any of these settings and hold that down, it'll give you a little bit of a rundown of the setting that you're currently looking at. And so this is really useful if you're a beginner and you just want to learn a little bit more about these. Maybe if I didn't do a good enough job explaining it or something, definitely just hit that question mark. It'll really give you a good rundown of that setting. All right, next up on the settings is white balance. So this right here is something that I always keep to auto. And the thing about white balance is when you shoot a raw image, all the white balance information is going to be saved, so you can change it to whatever you want in the editing software that you use. So personally, I don't even really worry about white balance, and I set it out auto because of 2 reasons. Reason number 1 is that the auto white balance on this camera does a pretty great job with photos, and I really never have too big of an issue with the white balance. It does a pretty great job at automatically setting the white balance for every picture that I take. And reason number 2 is that when I take the photo that I take into Adobe Lightroom, I can adjust the white balance to anything I want, and it does not degrade the image quality. It doesn't affect anything. It'll just change the white balance to however I want to set it in the editing software. So because of those 2 reasons, I always set this to auto. And even if you do shoot in JPEG, I think auto white balance does a fantastic job, and it's really something that you don't need to ever worry about. All right, so next setting is ISO sensitivity. Now I will be making a more general purpose guide to photography where I cover ISO more in depth. However, if you don't know anything about ISO, essentially what ISO does is it adjusts the brightness of your photos. That's a really rough explanation of it. So the lower the ISO number, the darker your image is going to be, and the cleaner the image is going to be. And what I mean by that is there's going to be less noise and less grain in the image. Now the higher you move your ISO number up, the image will get brighter, which will be better if you're shooting in darker conditions. However, it'll add a lot more grain and noise to your image, which is less pleasing. So I typically recommend to set your ISO at the lowest you possibly can go. So somewhere between 1, 2, and 400 ISO is pretty good with this camera. Anything higher than that, you're going to start getting a lot of grain and noise in your image, and it's going to degrade the image quality quite a bit. So a general rule of thumb is to set your ISO as low as you can, but so that the image still isn't too dark. Now there's probably thousands of amazing videos that really go in depth on ISO. So if you don't know anything about ISO, I'd recommend after this video just looking up an ISO tutorial on YouTube or how to set your ISO. And those videos will go way more in depth about ISO and teach you a lot more than I can. So I'd recommend doing that after you watch this video. Next up on the settings is active D-lighting. So if you go ahead and press the question mark here, there's a pretty big explanation. You can pause the video and read that, or just go on your camera and look at this. Essentially what active D-lighting does is adjust the highlights and shadows in your image to smooth out the image a lot more and basically improve your dynamic range or make the highlights and shadows less harsh. Now I turn this setting off, and actually when you're shooting in RAW, if this setting doesn't do anything to your photos, this will only affect your photos if you shoot in JPEG. Alright, so let's keep going down. Auto distortion control. This is grayed out because I don't have a compatible lens connected to the camera. Now if you do have a native Nikon lens, this probably won't be grayed out, and I'd recommend turning that on because what that does is help control the distortion that some lenses give your images. So whether this is vignetting or distortion from a really wide angle lens, the camera can help kind of control that and make it look a little better. So I definitely recommend turning this on if it isn't grayed out to you. Next up, color space. Keep this at sRGB, that's just the best overall option. Noise reduction, I keep this off. So essentially what this does is, let's say you're shooting at a higher ISO, like I said, there's going to be a lot of noise added to your images. This is going to kind of combat that and start reducing the noise out of the images. But personally, I keep this off because I can do that in my editing software, and I find that sometimes you'll do it too much and make the images almost look a little bit blurry. So I keep this off and just pretty much worry about that after I take the photos in my editing software. rather than baking in this noise reduction effect. Autofocus area mode, now there's two different options. So one is for when you use the viewfinder, which I'd recommend always using the viewfinder when you take photos. And one is for live view / movie, which is what you're going to use when you record videos, and it'll basically be displaying everything on the screen instead of the viewfinder. Now in the viewfinder, there's a couple different options. I usually switch between single point autofocus and 3D tracking. And so what these mean are basically what areas of the image is going to look at to autofocus. So if you have your subject like a person on the right side of the screen, you obviously want to focus on them on the right side of the screen, so you're going to set your autofocus point over to the right side of the screen here versus somewhere else on the screen. So I'd recommend playing with these and figure out which one works best for you. But single point autofocus is definitely the most versatile because you can select any point on the screen and it'll only focus on that point. And now for live view movie, I set this to face priority because most of the time, personally, when I record videos, there's going to be a person in the scene, and so face priority will focus on their face. Now if you're recording videos without people, I usually do wide area autofocus because they'll kind of have a wider area and just focus on what it thinks is best in that zone of the autofocus. But like I said, I would recommend just playing around with these and figuring out which one works best for whatever situation you're currently in. Next up, autofocus assist. I keep this off. What this is this red light bulb that pretty much illuminates whatever you're trying to focus on in low light settings. I find it super annoying. It's just this super bright red light, and I really just am not a big fan of it. I recommend always turning this off. If you're in that low of a light scenario, I'd recommend using manual focus or just adding more light to your scene. Next up, metering. I set this at matrix 100% of the time. And so what metering does is essentially, if you're in an automatic mode or aperture priority or one of the automatic modes that isn't fully manual, the camera obviously is gonna look over the image to figure out how to expose it properly so it's not too bright and not too dark. Now matrix metering is gonna look over the entire image and find a very good middle ground of where to set the brightness at. Now these other ones are gonna basically look at either the center or a certain spot on the screen, and it'll use that certain spot to basically set the exposure on that spot, which can be good if you have one specific thing that you want to be the correct brightness and everything else in the scene doesn't matter. But personally, I like to get a good middle ground where everything's pretty good, not super bright, not super dark, because I find that does the best job versus one thing being perfect and everything else being way overexposed or way underexposed. So the last two things are movie settings and built-in flash. So movie settings, I actually have a specific video talking about those, which I'm going to link in the description if you want to check that out and take videos with this camera. But I'm not going to be talking about video settings in this video because this is a specific photo settings video. And so the last thing, built-in flash, I set this at TTL. I find that does a good job, but personally I don't even use that built-in flash because I find it just does not do a very good job, and it just makes everything look super washed out and really just not very good. It almost makes it look like one of those disposable cameras, you know what I'm saying? It's like where the face or whatever you're focusing on is just super bright, everything else is dark and really flat, and I don't find it does a very good job. So personally, I wouldn't recommend using the flash, but if you do, just set it at TTL. And so there you go, that completes the entire shooting menu on the Nikon D3100. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to subscribe to my channel and give this video a like. And also check out my other videos about this camera. I have a review of it as well as the best video settings tutorial. I'll link both of those in the description. And I'm actually going to be dropping a few more videos about this camera in the future, so definitely stay tuned and subscribe if you're interested in more videos about the D3100. And that wraps this up. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.